What is up, everybody? Welcome into another episode of the Two Stripes podcast. My name is Colton Denning, and I am the host and proprietor and owner and whatever else you want to call of this here podcast, which, by the way, you can find on iTunes. If you search the Two Stripes podcast, I would recommend that you subscribe, of course, leave a review, leave a comment, any constructive criticism, anything that can help me get better and deliver the best possible college football podcast to you that I can would be greatly appreciated and definitely helps the show out. You can also find the show on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/twostripespod, where you can listen from your computer, your tablet, your iPhone, all that good stuff from the SoundCloud app as well. You can subscribe to us there, so make sure to check out soundcloud.com/twostripespod. All of the podcasts will be available there as well. So it's been a couple weeks since we talked, since the Alamo Bowl preview when I ended the podcast saying go Buffs and go Bucks, and both of those teams got absolutely shit kicked in their bowl, so it was a rough couple of weeks here at the Two Stripes Pod headquarters, but that's all right. You win some and you lose some, and you move on. I am recording this particular episode on Monday, January 9th, 2017, the first episode of the new year, the day of the national championship game between Alabama and Clemson, the rematch from last year's national championship game, and it should be a pretty damn good game. I think that Clemson has a very good shot at winning and scoring some points on Alabama's defense and being able to shut down Alabama's offense in ways that other teams haven't been able to. So very intrigued to see the matchups of this game and kind of what it would do for Clemson's football program if they were able to win the national championship and beat Alabama. So looking forward to that, and also saddened at the same time that it is the end of the college football season and we're about to embark on the long and cold offseason. But luckily for all of us, college football never stops, so I'll be around recording Two Stripes podcasts. I know there's a bunch of other college football podcasts that'll keep going, and the news cycle is constantly churning. Signing days less than a month away. So even though this is the final game of the season, there will definitely still be news to talk about all offseason. And speaking of the offseason, I figured that I would continue the offseason series that I've been doing, focusing on teams that didn't make bowl games this year, and decided to head to the SEC and talk a little Ole Miss football with Supertalk Mississippi and Red Cup Rebellion's Michael Borkey. In this episode, we talk a lot about some of the problems Mississippi had on defense this season, including how bad their run defense was, which if you didn't watch any of their games, especially LSU Auburn, was fairly repugnant. We also talked a lot about the transition between Chad Kelly and Shea Patterson heading into next season and the new offensive coaching staff and what that entails for Shea Patterson's growth as a quarterback. We also talked a little bit about the NCAA investigation into the school and how that's affected recruiting and why there's really no end in sight, at least that we know about, for that investigation, and just broke down some expectations of Ole Miss going forward and whether or not they can get back to that level that we saw them play at over the course of the last two seasons prior to this season. So without further ado, here is Michael Borkey talking all things Ole Miss football. All right, joining me now to talk all things Ole Miss football from Supertalk Mississippi, also affiliated with Red Cup Rebellion, is Michael Borkey. Michael, I'm looking at my calendar and it says January 5th. That means we're less than a month away from signing day, and I wanted to ask you, I'm not looking at a watch right now, so is it time to tweet at recruits?
It is never zero time to tweet at recruits. And of course, this time of year, it gets progressively worse, doesn't it? I mean, it was a hard day in this state here. I guess it was the 27th. So just, about a week ago, when probably the single greatest prospect to ever come out of the state of Mississippi committed to Florida State while sitting in the Mississippi Sports Hall of Fame. That was a tough day for Ole Miss fans. And of course, the fringe ones that like to be social media warriors decided to let him know what they thought about his decision. And it's just never a good look. It's something that shouldn't be done.
It's awful. And before we get into Ole Miss, I want to talk a little bit about that because, like, on the same front, JT Barrett just announced he was coming back to Ohio State on Twitter. And, like, after how they looked in the playoff game and how kind of up and down he's been all season, like, that was an issue with the fringe fans, too. And, like, is there anything worse than not only a dude that does that to a college athlete or a recruiter, really anybody, to be quite honest, but then, like, the dude that doubles down on it, especially in recruiting, when you call him out and they're like, whatever, man, this is a free platform. You know, I get to do what I want. I think I'm helping Ole Miss. Like, there's nothing worse than that.
Not at all. And for whatever reason, they do feel like they're helping. And God bless them. You got to admire their dedication to their team, but that does nothing but hurt. You will never one time ever in recruiting see a player, when asked, why did you pick X school, him say, because they tweeted at me more in recruiting. It'll never happen.
You hear that, Tennessee fans? We're talking directly to you, Volunteer fans. All right, well, let's get a little bit into the season here for Ole Miss. 5-7, 2-6 in the SEC. And, of course, like, the high-profile start, the game against FSU where they blew the early lead, and then the Bama game, which looked like, not that they had in hand, but a game where, arguably, even looking back on it, I want to say even with the LSU game that Bama played in Death Valley, even though it was a close score, a 10-0 game, that game really wasn't that close. I think, like, looking back on the Ole Miss-Bama game, that was probably their closest chance of losing on the season. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And the national media, of course, will just point to that LSU game. I guess they kind of forgot what happened in September in Oxford. But around here, we were always kind of pointing to that game as what looked to be the toughest game on Alabama's schedule just because of quarterback Chad Kelly. He had a great game against Alabama in Tuscaloosa and a win a year prior. And if you eliminate all of the off-field stuff, you know, the rap song from high school, the running onto the field in a high school game, getting kicked out of Clemson, if you eliminate that and just look at him as a football player, I mean, he was an elite quarterback. He could make all the throws. He had an outstanding strong arm. He was a good athlete, too. He could run. And that was, especially paired with their wide receivers, Alabama's best shot at losing until they got to the playoff. Of course, Ole Miss's defense was, to put it nicely, atrocious, and they had no chance at winning that football game just because defensively they were so bad. Still, I mean, 400 yards, 420 yards passing, 3 touchdowns. It's just, that was Chad Kelly being Chad Kelly and really nothing more. But that was their best shot at losing, yeah.
In the 2 years prior, too, they beat Alabama, and they were looking for the 3 in a row. And you look at that game, and you mentioned the numbers. They played it, I want to say, like a 98% in the offensive percentile per Bill C's numbers. What is it about Hugh Freeze and that Ole Miss offense, and maybe it's Chad Kelly and the receivers that they've had over the last couple of seasons? What is it that gives Alabama so many problems when they have to defend Ole Miss?
This is probably going to be a bit of a hot take, but even with all of the NFL guys that Nick Saban and Alabama have churned out over the last couple of years, I think they've had a weakness in the defensive secondary. And Ole Miss has had the receiver core paired with the great quarterback, and even Bo Wallace was still pretty good in his own right, to counter that weakness. I mean, you saw this year where Austin Allen also threw for 400 yards and 3 touchdowns against that Alabama defense. They're susceptible in the secondary despite being incredibly talented. And I think it's a combination of a couple of things. That game 3 years ago in Oxford, that was Ole Miss played perfect football. Alabama made a couple of mistakes. It was just one of those days in college football where nobody was beating Ole Miss that day, no matter who it was. The next year, it was more so just Chad Kelly and that offense executing as well as they possibly could. Alabama's secondary, I know the stats don't show it, and the narrative going into the college football playoff championship game is Alabama's defense is impenetrable. But I watched it in person, and I watched every game they played this year. They are susceptible in the defensive secondary somewhat compared to what the national narrative is. And I think that's part of it as well. So Ole Miss really gets up for Alabama, and then Chad Kelly and a really, really good receiving core was able to exploit the weakness in Alabama that not many teams in the SEC are capable of.
That's certainly something that you'd see Chad Kelly, former Clemson kid, and now Deshaun Watson, who had a lot of success in last year's championship game against the Tide. Maybe they'll be able to repeat that and this time get a win. And you look at Clemson's receivers and some of the other weapons they have on offense, and you would think that they have a very good chance of duplicating that. But talking about Chad Kelly, one of my favorite things when people talk about relationships is like when a relationship ends, a lot of the times people go to like the polar opposite of what the person they were dating was. So Ole Miss goes from Chad Kelly to Shea Patterson. And I don't know a ton about Shea Patterson other than he was a very well-regarded recruit coming in this season. But like you said, we know all the stuff about Chad Kelly with the songs and the going onto the field, the AK, all that stuff. Is that like a thing where like you go from Chad Kelly, who was a great player, but like just a polar opposite person, to Shea Patterson?
It seems that way. Now, Shea's only been at Ole Miss for just a year, but as far as any of us can tell, he hasn't even come close to getting himself into any trouble, which is a very positive sign for Ole Miss fans, I'm sure. And he seems much tamer. They don't have to worry about him getting in trouble at night. But as far as the type of quarterback they are, and I know that's not the question you asked, but we just have no sample size with Shea because he hasn't gotten himself anywhere. He hasn't said anything dumb on social media. He hasn't charged a high school field to get involved in a fight that his brother's in. He hasn't released a rap song that's horrible. He hasn't done any of those things. So all that's a positive sign. But as far as the type of player that they are, pretty similar. Kelly's a little bit bigger guy. Shea Patterson's arm is probably better. He came in with more arm talent than Kelly did. But a very similar quarterback. Patterson's a better runner, just not as big. So, but they have a very similar type game.
You mentioned the running, and we saw with Bo Wallace a couple years back. They weren't afraid to run him. Certainly with the size of Chad Kelly, they weren't afraid to run him. And in the 3 games that Patterson played, I think he had over 13 attempts in each game. And I don't know how many of those were designed and how many were scrambles. The only one real clip I've seen of Shea Patterson was the Johnny Manziel-esque touchdown that he threw against Texas A&M, where he really did look like Manziel, and it was pretty eerie the way that he reversed field and threw that ball. Is that what he kind of brings to the table that Ole Miss quarterbacks maybe haven't? Is that ability to improvise while also having probably more speed than Wallace and Chad Kelly, but also the arm?
It's for being a freshman, his pocket awareness is pretty amazing when you think about his ability to be elusive yet somehow still keep his eyes downfield. That's something that a lot of quarterbacks, a trait that they may never acquire. I mean, you've seen a lack of development in college, especially in the SEC, just a lack of quarterback development. He is extremely polished, and his elusiveness is better than Kelly and Wallace's, and his speed's a little bit better. But one thing that you did notice in those 3 games where a lot of freshman quarterbacks would have, if they escape the pocket and see a lot of grass in front of them, they just go ahead and take it and take off running. But he kept his eyes downfield a lot more than you would expect a freshman quarterback to, and that's where you saw those Manziel comparisons, because even though Johnny ran around a lot, he was still able to do that as well. Of course, it helped having Mike Evans as a receiver for Manziel, but he was drawing those kind of comparisons because they looked very, very similar. They even carried the football the same, which they shouldn't do. He carries it in the palm of his hand and runs like a track baton instead of tucking it and protecting the football. But eerily similar, him and Johnny Manziel, the way they act, hopefully for Ole Miss fans, just on the field and nothing more beyond that. But the elusiveness paired with the ability to keep his eyes downfield is something that, despite how touted he was coming out of high school, I didn't really expect to see so early for him.
It's interesting that you brought up Mike Evans and how, big he was in the success of Manziel. And Shea Patterson's going to have a ton of talent around him coming next year between Van Jefferson, A.J. Brown, DK Metcalf, and DeMarcus Lodge coming back. And most of those dudes are young. How excited are people to see that passing offense, and especially in a guy like Phil Longo, who they bring in from Sam Houston State to be offensive coordinator? A lot of plays, a lot of yards, speed, and points in that type of pseudo air raid system. What are kind of the expectations for the offense going next year, and Shea Patterson in particular?
That's the funny thing about this Ole Miss team is, even though this year, especially in the second half, they really struggled adjusting to a game plan. So they get rid of Dan Werner for whatever reason. There's a lot of rumors circulating behind the real reason behind his termination. But regardless, they bring in Phil Longo in that air raid system. If his system translates to Division I, which football is football, but in my opinion, it was a bit of a risky hire just because he's never done it or called plays at this level before. And there are things that work at Sam Houston State against Southland opponents that just don't work in big-time college football. So I'm interested to see how his offense translates. He's also never recruited a Division I athlete before. But with the wide receiver core that you mentioned, I mean, there's a couple of NFL guys on that. Trey Nixon comes off of a red shirt, and he's the fastest receiver on the team, a kid that they got out of Florida. The receiver core very well could be one of the best in the SEC next year, despite losing Evan Ingram and despite losing DeMaurier Stringfellow. Those young kids coming back all physically looked the part. Van Jefferson's dad is a wide receiver coach in the NFL, so he comes from a great pedigree. And A.J. Brown, if you look at a picture of freshman A.J. Brown and junior Laquan Treadwell, they wear the same jersey number. You can't tell the difference. I mean, physically looks just like him and plays like him. And Metcalf was the biggest freak out of the group, but broke his foot, I guess, in the second game of the year against Wofford, and is going to take a medical red shirt. But that is a position group that is extremely dangerous. And Phil Longo, when he's watching film of his team and gets ready for spring practice, should be very excited. The problem was for Ole Miss last year, and really in Hugh Freeze's entire tenure, was the lack of the ability to run the football against quality opponents. If you look at years past, some of their running numbers look and appear to be good, but that's because they played Presbyterian and other schools where they could kind of pad their stats rushing. They've never successfully run the football against a quality opponent. The Phil Longo hire, when you hear air raid and hear the Mike Leach tree, it doesn't at first sound like something that would be good for Ole Miss in fixing their inability to run the football. But if you look at his offense and his stats from Sam Houston State, he actually, this past year, in his 3 years as coordinator there, was the first time they passed the football more than they ran it. So he's got very good running stats as well. The difference is, or the problem is, I guess, is it seems to be the same type of rushing attack. And Ole Miss, for whatever reason, in that offense has not been able to run the football effectively. So what we're going to learn, I guess, is going to be week 3, because the first 2 weeks of 2017 are South Alabama and UT Martin. They go to Tuscaloosa in week 3. We're going to find out how much emphasis Longo puts on not just running the football, but doing it successfully, because there were times a year ago, like LSU and Baton Rouge in the second half, where LSU just keyed on stopping the pass and Ole Miss still couldn't run on them. So they've got to find a way to have effective offensive balance, and that's the biggest challenge for Phil Longo. You know that they're going to be able to throw the football and catch the football with Shea Patterson and those receivers, but running the ball is a huge, huge question mark this offseason for that team.
And in the air raid system, you can look back at Mike Leach and what he did at Texas Tech and now Washington State, and what Baylor did for the better half of the last decade under Art Briles before he was fired, and then Kevin Sumlin with Texas A&M. And like you said, those offenses kind of get tended to put into just a strictly pass first category, because you hear air raid and you think pass, pass, pass. But usually when those offenses have been most successful, especially Baylor's and those Texas Tech passing offenses, or just offenses in general, they've been able to run the ball. So do you think that it's a matter of personnel? It's just an identity thing? I know that coming into the season, offensive line and depth on the offensive line was a big concern for Ole Miss, and now it seems like they've built that depth up a little bit, and they were extremely young there. Do you have high expectations or high hopes that, not that they're going to have, one of the 15 best run games in the country, but if they have like a top 30 run game, is that just going to take the offense to the next level?
It should, because simply put, they have not been able to run the football. A couple of things. One, last year's struggles to run the ball, I think in part was due to a lack of experience up front. Their senior center/tackle, he was kind of a utility guy, and Robert Conyers messed up his knee his junior year, so 2 seasons ago now, and he was never really the same, and then re-injured it again this year. On top of that, you were starting a true freshman at left tackle and another redshirt freshman at right tackle. And so that, in my opinion, was part of it. Greg Little needed to shed a little baby weight and kind of needed to get acclimated to playing Division I football, just as a true freshman, as you would expect one to do. He's got a tremendous upside, but probably just wasn't ready to be inserted into that role as quickly as he was. The other left tackle, by the way, was a converted guard who had a serious problem playing tackle. That's not the position for him. And the other part, Phil Longo hinted at it. He said that the run-pass option, which is something that the Ole Miss offense under Dan Werner and Hugh Freeze's control, was something they did a lot. he said it's a problem. It causes problems running the football because your offensive line, by rule, they cannot generate push, or else if the quarterback decides to pull up and throw the football, there's an illegal man downfield. And so he's going to fade that offense away from the run-pass option and allow the offensive line to go to work in run schemes like they're supposed to. I thought that was an interesting point because Ole Miss has been so successful with the run-pass option, but apparently that success is only one-sided according to Phil Longo, because he's going to almost eliminate it from that offense and allow the offensive line to go to work. So the way he did it was very political, but it sounded like the scheme for Ole Miss the last few years has been the reason, more so the reason why they couldn't run the football than lack of players. Because if you look at, and I know they're not foolproof, but if you look at the recruiting rankings and the offer list of all the guys that are going to play offensive line for Ole Miss this year, that was a very well-recruited group. That's a talented group, and they didn't perform as such last year and the year prior. So if the scheme changes and they start running the football better, well, Phil Longo kind of predicted this back during his introductory press conference.
And speaking of things that probably are going to get better and should get better if Ole Miss is to make that turn and kind of be where they've been at the last 3 or 4 years. At the start of the podcast, you brought up the defense, and we're finally going to have to talk about it. And, I want to take you back to 2014. That group with Mike Hilton, Tony Connor, Detarian Shackelford, Serdarius Bryant, Cody Pruitt, the Kimdichis, Senquez Golson. You can go up all down the list of dudes that were great at Mississippi and a lot of dudes that are in the NFL right now. They were the best defense in the country 2 years ago, and it almost carried them to the national championship, and they were pretty good last year too, and they fell all the way to 72nd in defensive S&P Plus this season. New defensive coordinator in Wesley McGriff, and he's another dude like Phil Longo coming in from the lower ranks, kind of an unknown name, hasn't recruited at this level. What does he bring to the table, and what's the hope for them to turn around that defense, to not get it to, where they were in 2014, but back to the usual brand of defensive football that they play?
Oh, sure. And it's kind of funny when you think about it. Ole Miss, despite kind of what is thought about them nationally, on the defensive side of the ball, has recruited absolutely terrible in all 5 years that Hugh Freeze has been to Ole Miss. They had to do something on that side of the ball to change the way, not just the culture was about how they play defense and the scheme, but how they recruited that side of the ball. There is countless numbers of signing day misses from that side of the ball, especially linebacker and safety, where Ole Miss put the full court press on these national guys like Niles Morgan, Clifton Garrett, Shaheem Carter, and missed and didn't have a plan B or a backup plan. So even if you look at the 2013 class, which is the one that made all the headlines, take Robert Kimdichis away from that class, and Tony Connor would have been great, but he tore his knee up. And then the rest of it really nondescript. And despite having a couple of talented defensive linemen, Deontay Anderson is a safety out of Texas that was a freshman this year that played pretty good football, and he was highly recruited. They have failed at recruiting defensive players in all 5 years. They haven't done it well at all. And Dave Womack, the defensive coordinator, didn't recruit. And he was also the linebacker coach. After Tom Allen, who is now the head coach at Indiana, who was the linebacker coach at Ole Miss, after he left, they promoted a guy named Corey Batoon, who was a career GA, to the safeties coach, and that experiment did not work out. They needed recruiting on that side of the ball. And so they hire Wesley McGriff, who hasn't called plays in any scheme in almost 2 decades. But the thing about him is he is a well-known elite recruiter here in the Southeast. And that's what they needed more so from their defensive staff than anything else. They needed players. They needed bodies. It's much easier to call a scheme when you have the appropriate players to execute that scheme. And a couple of guys on that defensive staff, Dave Womack, the Corey Batoon, who was a safeties coach experiment, just didn't work out. He was not effective at all on the recruiting trail. And even Chris Kiffin, who's now with his brother, he's going to be the defensive coordinator at FAU. He was the defensive line coach. They just needed a complete staff overhaul on that side of the ball, not just scheme. They were running a 4-2-5, and for whatever reason, despite defenses being so mix and match now and so dynamic, the 4-2-5 really scares off linebackers, so they couldn't recruit a linebacker. Defensive line recruiting, they would get the front-end starters, and that would be fine, but depth was a bit of an issue. They needed an entire staff overhaul. So they get Wesley McGriff, who's a dynamic recruiter. We'll see about the play calling. We just simply don't know. He hasn't done it in 2 decades. He said he's going to run a 4-3 scheme. We'll see what that looks like and how he calls plays. We just have no idea. Trey Scott, the defensive line coach, is a young dude. I think he's 29 years old, comes from North Carolina, the same position. He's been at Ole Miss before. Apparently is an up-and-comer as far as his recruiting prowess. And then LSU's old linebacker coach is now at Ole Miss. So they changed the culture recruiting-wise. It's just schematically and what McGriff brings to the table as far as being an actual defensive coordinator, we just don't know. I mean, he hasn't called plays before. He has been with the Saints. He was a defensive back coach in New Orleans and just most recently at Auburn. So he's been involved in game planning even at the NFL level. But it's a completely different game when you are the one calling the plays and developing the scheme and has the final say. So just like Longo, we're not going to know until week 3 in Tuscaloosa, at least an early look, on what kind of coordinator he's going to be.
On Red Cup, I was doing a little bit of research, and one of the articles about kind of Wesley McGriff and what he brings to the table mentioned a stat from Edwards of Ole Miss Sports that said that Ole Miss allowed over 1,900 yards before contact on the ground this season. And if you equate that out, that's over a mile. That is 1.1 miles of yards before contact in the running game. And in a conference that, at least for right now, and maybe it'll change next year, I know that there's some more high-profile quarterback recruits coming in, but especially this season that had such a dearth of quarterback play and a lot was predicated on the run, is that has to be like priority number 1 for them, is even if the pass defense is still not good, is stopping the run, right?
I mean, you should have seen, I don't know if you watched the LSU Ole Miss game, but that was the most embarrassing display of front 7 defense you could ever watch in your entire life. And I just got through talking about extensively how they needed bodies on that side of the ball, and they changed the culture by getting coaches that are proven recruiters. But on top of everything else, last year they just weren't coached very well on that side of the ball. If you sat down and watched an Ole Miss game, the linebacker play was so bad, and not just because they had bad athletes there. I mean, they had a senior grad transfer who was the leading tackler on Oregon State's team a year ago. They had DeMarcus Gates, who led the team in tackles a year prior. A guy named Dietrich Bing-Dukes, who was a JUCO transfer who signed with Georgia out of high school. So it's not like they were completely void of talent. Part of it, I think, was coaching as well. And Ole Miss, in my opinion, and it's kind of taboo to say around here, lacked a great coaching staff in Hugh Freeze's entire tenure. They peaked with that Sugar Bowl win in 10-3. That was the best that staff could do, in my opinion, due to lack of experience or lack of recruiting connections and prowess, and they needed that turnover. It has to start with stopping the run, because there were times a year ago, especially in the Auburn game, where they really had a shot to win the game, but the defense could just never get off the field. And Cameron Petway, I mean, they made it look like he was, have you ever seen the movie Billy Madison, where he plays dodgeball with the first graders? That's what Cameron Petway and Leonard Fournette looked like against the Ole Miss defense. But that's what they need. Even the secondary is not all that untalented. We've got a couple of corners that are quality Division I corners. They've got young safeties, but talented safeties. It's really the front 7 that needs the most work. And in those games with the offenses like Auburn and like LSU, it got exposed far worse than it would have against, say, a Georgia, just because Georgia was so bad. But once they got into SEC West play with teams that, even though the league is way down, teams with a pulse like those two, it got exposed bad.
Well, and when you're letting Kyle Shermer average 9.1 yards per attempt, and that's not your biggest problem, you definitely have something going wrong. So a couple more and then we'll get you out of here. You mentioned the recruiting has taken a little bit of a dip, and that 2013 class, of course, was one of the most storied, I think, in at least modern recruiting history, not only because of the talent that came in, but also because everybody was like, whoa, Ole Miss is bringing in who? Like Laquan, a kid from Illinois, and Denzel or Robert Kimdichie. This is crazy. And they even had a pretty good class last year. I want to say it was 10th in the 24/7.
It was, yeah. It was somewhere in the top 10, depending on the service you look at, yeah.
And you look at this class right now with about a month left, or less than a month, 38th in the 24/7 sports composite. How much of that can be pinned on kind of just the general coaching staff change that we've seen in the past couple of months? You even see that Matt Lubick, the guy that they hired from Oregon, left to take the Baylor offensive coordinator job, and they've had some turnover there. But also, The NCAA investigation, how much of a role has that played in what Ole Miss is doing on the recruiting trail right now?
I would chalk it up 90% of the reason why they're not recruiting or going to recruit well in this cycle is the NCAA investigation. It has been going on at that school for almost 5 years now. It's been a very long, very painstaking for Ole Miss fans investigation because you're not getting anything from the university. Nobody's talking. Nobody's saying anything. Information, if you get it, you have to really think about reporting it because it's been misleading. The last few times there's been a leak in information about how close they are to coming to a close or what's in the notice of allegations before it was released. The people in the media, we were told that it was predominantly women's basketball and track and field, and that turned out to not be the case. And so it's really hard to decipher the information that's coming out, and that uncertainty with the investigation is causing a huge problem in recruiting. It's pretty well understood around here that if there was no NCAA investigation, Cam Akers would be going to Ole Miss. A guy named Dede Bowie, who's a 4-star wide receiver from the state of Mississippi, if Florida State offers him, he's also going to go to Florida State, even though he's been committed to Ole Miss for what feels like forever because of the NCAA investigation. The investigation also played a role in who they could go after as far as hiring assistant coaches. The uncertainty is a huge problem because the NCAA, there's no end in sight right now. They are digging through any possible lead they can get, and that's been a problem. And you've seen the fruits of that labor, so to speak, with Ole Miss's recruiting class based on who they've offered recently. They just took a commitment today from a guy whose only Division I offer is Ole Miss. They are sending offers to guys that they wouldn't have dared recruit last year or the year prior or the year prior. But they have to fill a class right now, and they only have 15 commitments. To fill a recruiting class and fit needs, they're going to have to offer some guys that are considered fringe prospects because the big name guys or the ones that are highly sought after that they were going after and occasionally signing the last few years are simply not going to go to Ole Miss right now. And despite Wesley McGriff being a great recruiter and his hiring has given them a bump, it's not enough right now. The uncertainty has to end because other schools, as they should, if I was a coach at another school, I would have my people be doing this, getting in these kids' ears, telling them that a 2-year bowl ban is coming, things like that. And these kids, despite what the media tells you about the games being meaningless, want to play in bowl games. They want to play in the postseason. And if they're being told, hey, you're an NFL prospect, you're only going to college for 3 years, and 2 of those years, you won't even be able to play in the postseason at Ole Miss, it's taking its toll, as it should. Because the way Ole Miss has handled this and the uncertainty that's surrounding the program with this NCAA investigation is just too much to overcome right now, and they're feeling the effects, especially in this recruiting class.
So there's no timetable, and nobody really knows how severe those punishments are going to be when they come down, right?
No, because the first notice of allegations was handed down, I guess, back in April. And if you read through them, they didn't find anything substantial. Nothing in the original notice of allegations would warrant even a bowl ban. It was very petty stuff. It was a recruit crashed on an assistant coach's couch for a night. It was Laramie Tunsil. It didn't say that in the NOA, but that's who it was. Had a loaner car that he kept too long. Those petty things, the total amount of benefits that were tallied up were less than $16,000 over a 5-year period. It was nothing that would warrant major sanctions. The problem was the notice of allegations gets handed down. Ole Miss responds to those notice of allegations before they can get with the COI. Draft night happened. And that essentially reopened the entire investigation, and Barney Farrar, or Farrer, however you want to say it, I've heard it both ways, was a assistant athletic director for high school relations, whatever his title was. Dan Werner, the old offensive coordinator, this is a lot to follow, had an exemption from the NCAA that did not force, he could be off the recruiting trail permanently, and Barney Farrar could take his place as an on-field coach, technically, on the recruiting trail. Barney Farrar apparently is a widely known, very popular recruiter, knows where all the bodies are buried, all of that stuff. Werner lost his exemption because he recently got married. His exemption was something to do with he had a son that needed special attention, so he didn't have to recruit. Well, after he got married, that exemption expired. Barney Farrar goes away. That might help Ole Miss because he was in the text messages that you saw on draft night. But at the end of the day, we have no idea what they're investigating. Not for sure. We don't know what kind of penalties or what they have found or what they could be. There's simply no end in sight. And some media around here were trying to say that April would be the time where they would get their a resolution. And it's just, that's hard to believe at this time. Because if you just look at the timetable of NCAA investigations, if Ole Miss was handed an amended notice of allegations today, April still would be too soon. So there's nothing, unfortunately, to report right now because there's little to no information coming out. But that uncertainty, I think, is a problem. And no stone is being unturned by the NCAA in Oxford. And there's no end in sight. Not right now.
All right, well, putting all that aside, last one, we've talked about the young potential on offense with Shea Patterson and those young talented receivers and the line that's going to be a year older, and the defense probably not getting any worse at the very least, and the new coordinators on each side of the ball. What do you think is a reasonable expectation for Ole Miss in 2017?
Reasonable with the fans, reasonable is 9 wins and nothing below, but this team can, because of the schedule, go back to a bowl game, but they desperately need to. I am of the opinion that Hugh Freeze can't survive 5-7 or 4-8 if the NCAA hands down any sort of significant sanction. Whether or not they do that, I don't know. They start with UT Martin and South Alabama, then go to Cal instead of Florida State for their non-conference. They have Kentucky from the SEC East instead of Georgia. So the schedule sets up nicely. But to expect, all things considered, anything above 8 wins is looking at things through red and blue glasses. But I wouldn't expect much better than a 7-5, 6-6 type season. It's just there was a lot of things wrong with that defense last year. I do think that they've upgraded in coaching, but there were a lot of problems there, and they're still in the SEC West. And I think 7-5, I guess, looking at that schedule, is probably a realistic expectation and would help right the ship for Ole Miss and get them back going in a positive direction.
All right, well, you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. Michael Borkey of Supertalk Mississippi. You can find his work there. You can also find it on Twitter at Michael Borkey, and also a contributor for Red Cup Rebellion. If you want to find their work, it's redcuprebellion.com. And also at Red Cup Rebellion, I also understand a co-host of Podcast Rebellion for Red Cup Rebellion. So make sure to check out all of his work. Michael, want to thank you for joining the show and being a fellow proponent of never tweeting at recruits. I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Colton. Anytime. By the way, Clemson's going to beat Alabama in the national championship game on Monday.
I like it. I'm right there with you. I think that, like we talked about, they have the passing offense. I think that defense, like we saw against Ohio State, can get after them, and that's going to be the key. If they get after Jalen Hurts and pressure him, they haven't really seen the defense do that all game, and I think that Clemson will be able to exploit that.
I agree with you. Have a good one.
There you have it. Want to thank Michael Borkey once again for joining the podcast. You can check out all of his work at Michael Borkey on Twitter, also at Supertalk Mississippi and Red Cup Rebellion. I'm very interested to see how Phil Longo's offense plays in the SEC West and what kind of success they're able to have, especially given that it'll be Shea Patterson's first full year of starting, and he's got all those great receivers around him. So I think if they're able to run the ball, they're going to have a lot of success, even in a tough division like that. But as Michael said, the defense definitely has to improve, it would seem, for them to make up some ground and get to a bowl game. So a lot of intriguing things going on at Ole Miss, even when you leave out the NCAA investigation and all the offseason stuff that is happening to that school right now. But that'll just about do it for this episode of the Two Stripes podcast. I want to thank Michael again for joining, and you, the listener, for listening. If you like it or dislike it, make sure to go on iTunes and either subscribe if you do like it and leave a comment, leave a review about some of the stuff you like, some of the stuff you don't like. Whatever feedback you have, it is greatly appreciated. And then you can also find it at soundcloud.com/twostripespod. All the podcasts will be posted there as well. So if you don't have an iPhone or you don't want to use iTunes, then you can find the podcast there on your computer, tablet, smartphone, all that good stuff. But that'll do it for this episode of the Two Stripes podcast. I'm Colton Denning. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you all enjoy the final game of the 2016-17 college football season. I'll talk to you later on in the week.